Well, welcome everyone. My name is Bormanis. I am a television writer and producer, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to interview one of my favorite writers and someone who's become a friend, Rob Sawyer. And Rob has been writing science fiction for, gosh, the better part of probably 30 years.
Yes.
He is an accomplished novelist, Hugo Nebula Award winner, has, I don't even know the number at the moment because it keeps changing, 20 some odd novels in...
The 21st novel came out in April.
Okay, great. So obviously a very experienced and respected writer, person who is very interested in the same questions that brought all of you here, the question of whether we were alone in the universe, the origin of life, and what does it mean for us as a species, as a society, to grapple with these questions. Rob is Canadian. He is probably the foremost light of Canadian science fiction, certainly one of the great lights of modern science fiction. And I believe your training originally in college was in anthropology, archaeology?
You know, it was not.
Oh.
At the very last minute decision, I had applied for, and actually what I was interested in was paleontology. Ah. And I'd applied for and been accepted to study paleontology at the University of Toronto and the University of Waterloo, two of Canada's finest. And I made a 11th hour decision, because I'd actually been accepted, and even into residency, to study broadcasting instead. I actually have a degree in radio and television arts from Ryerson University, which is Canada's top broadcasting program. I thought I wanted perhaps someday in my life to be a television scriptwriter. It took 30 circuitous years with a detour into writing a lot of novels to get there. But I've always maintained this fascination with paleontology. And as you well know, being a writer yourself, being a writer gets you an entree to anybody you want to meet. Yeah. And over the years, I've gotten to know a number of world-famous paleontologists. And I've had the great pleasure of counting them as friends. Michael Brett Surman, the dinosaur specialist at the Smithsonian, Phil Currie, Canada's top dinosaur specialist. And what I've discovered is they all love their work, but hate the administration, hate the politics of museums or universities. And I think actually in the end I ended up not only making possibly the right choice, economically, but the right choice for my temperament as well. There's less BS. Imagine that in television and in publishing than there is in academia.
Right. No, I think you're quite correct about that. And it's interesting what you say about the writer's temperament. You know, I think, who was it? Maybe a novelist I like named Paul Auster, who said that, you know, writing is something that people do because they really have exhausted every other possible thing that they could do. And, you know, nothing else really appeals to them.
That's right.
You end up kind of like, well, I guess I can do this. But it's also the opportunity to really explore so many different fields and ideas and other lives. You get to kind of be other people.
Yes.
Do you find when you write your novels that you really sort of take on the persona of the protagonists?
Yes. And it's been very important to me to stretch as a writer by writing people who are radically different from me. My most recently completed trilogy, Wake, Watch, and Wonder, about the World Wide Web gaining consciousness, the two main characters, obviously, the World Wide Web, which is nothing at all like me as a person. I actually am instantiated in a mobile body, and it is not. And a 15-year-old blind girl math genius. It's been a long time since I've been 15. I've never been blind, and my friends will tell you, and certainly my accountant will affirm, that I'm not a math genius. And being able to walk, you know, I spent 3 years writing books about her, miles, kilometers in her shoes, gave me an enormous empathy. Every time, you know, I actually think being a writer, I don't want to be grandiose about it, but makes you a better person because you learn to see the world from other people's perspectives. You find, you know, you talk to the average person on the street, and they'll have a black and white view. This is right, this is wrong. So, you know, no, there's actually all kinds of shades of gray here. And I think we get that from that empathetic quality that comes out of living other lives.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with the World Wide Web trilogy. And how much research went into that for you? Obviously, we all use the web. We all understand Google and, you know, and the basics of the internet.
Right.
Some more than others, you know. Some think of it as a series of tubes, as
yes,
politicians.
the intertubes.
Which is not necessarily a bad analogy.
Yes.
How did you go about, first of all, for the technical side of things?
Right.
And
Right.
then for the character, for this 15-year-old
Yeah,
girl.
there were two elements to the technical side. One was simply I had to learn to understand better than I did the architecture of the internet, the underlying architecture on which the World Wide Web supervenes. And you know, prior to kind of making it as a science fiction writer, which you know, happened in my 30s, I'd had to make a living, and I made my living in the 80s, in my 20s, being a science and technology journalist doing an awful lot of stuff about computing. So I understood packet switching networks, I understood Ethernet, I understood all kinds of things that were precursors to getting the World Wide Web up and running. The biggest single problem for me was coming up with something that passed my own BS detector. When emergent consciousness has been done in science fiction, on a computer substrate, it's always been done either totally unbelievably, like, come on, it could never possibly happen that way if you know anything about computing, or completely off stage. William Gibson, who at the time he wrote Neuromancer, knew nothing about computing and composed it on a manual typewriter, chose for the off stage. And I wanted to write the first time ever, from the first moment of self-awareness to the end of life, billions of years in the future, of an emergent consciousness, and have it all happen on stage. So the real technical stuff, once you master how the internet works, and you can learn that in an afternoon, it is not a complex system fundamentally.
It's a series of tubes.
It's a series of tubes, is to learn the complexity of emergence, and to study systems theory and information theory and try and get a handle on how it was that we developed consciousness, actual symbolic thinking, and self-awareness, the great Cartesian cogito ergo sum. Where did that come from? How did this very simple, you know, few pounds, 3.5 pounds of gray matter, all of that emerges? How did it emerge historically? So it actually, you mentioned anthropology, which is a great interest of mine. Cognitive anthropology became very much a cornerstone for this. Where did the character come from? There was a fascinating paper I read some years ago that was by the son of Fritz Leiber. Fritz Leiber, the great horror fantasy writer, Hugo winner, and his son is a philosopher and psychologist. And he wrote a paper called Helen Keller as Cognitive Scientist. And he was making the point that fundamentally it would be impossible for any of us who have been fully sighted, had a full sensorium for our whole lives, to comprehend what her world was like. And to me, them's fighting words to a writer. When you say you can't possibly do it, I think, well, there you can. Maybe you can. Why don't I try that? So the basis for the character, the whole dynamic in the novel is this young girl who is convinced that there is, in the infrastructure of the World Wide Web, a consciousness that nobody else believes is there, a rational consciousness. The parallel is Helen Keller is the consciousness that nobody believes is there. And Annie Sullivan, the miracle worker, the title of the other William Gibson, by the way, William Gibson, another one, wrote The Miracle Worker. William Gibson, who sold more copies is the playwright, obviously, William Gibson, but nobody remembers that these days. That Gibson wonderfully captured this notion that if you are emergent but isolated sensorially, somebody has to uplift you, give you that hand up. Helen Keller had that through Annie Sullivan. And my character of Caitlin Decter, the 15-year-old formerly blind girl, Annie Sullivan was formerly blind. She had had her blindness, you know, legally blind. I mean, she had some light perception, but there had been a very crude operation that had given her vision at 19. And she became kind of a tutor at this school for the blind, and ultimately that's what got her the job of being the governess to Helen Keller. And so that's where the dynamic came from, and why my character was blind.
Oh, terrific. One of my favorite of your books is Rollback, which deals with a subject that I certainly, and probably most people, spend some time thinking about, which is the question of our own mortality and whether or not we can actually extend life in a meaningful way, in a healthful way. And your book, Rollback, addresses that quite directly. And one of the characters, particular is an astronomer.
Yes.
And has some interest in the question of intelligent life in the universe. And I thought that it was very inventive and interesting the way that you kind of merged those themes in that book. Obviously, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is, the sort of guiding principle that brought us all here to talk about these subjects today. Talk a little bit about your own interest in extraterrestrial intelligence, something off Earth, and how we as human beings might respond to that, and what we are doing to try to prepare ourselves for
Yes,
that
yes.
eventuality.
I'm absolutely fascinated by the notion of extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, you, of course, are most famous amongst your many accomplishments for your work in Star Trek. And I grew up in the 1960s, and so Mr. Spock was probably the first alien with any kind of sophistication to the construction of the character that I was exposed to. And this notion that he had a different way of perceiving reality. I'm an empiricist, I'm a rationalist, but I do understand that our sensorium, our perception shades everything about the way we think and approach things. And there's elements of Spock in that, elements of that in Spock. And then you get into other aliens from Star Trek, the Horta, for instance, radically non-humanoid life form. And all of this really fascinated me. And yet, I've always been a skeptic at heart. In the 1960s, the 50s and 60s were the heyday of UFOs.
Yeah.
And I never gave it any credence. I never thought that any of the, even as a kid, that any of the evidence was credible. So it always seemed to me that if we were going to communicate with aliens, it would be at a remove, at a distance. And I've been fascinated by the SETI undertaking because of that. And one of the things that, I'm a pacifist, I'm a liberal, I was raised a Unitarian, and there's something that Frank Drake alluded to in his lunchtime keynote, which is a thought that others have said before. There was a great conference devoted to SETI some years ago in Canada called Encoding Altruism, because what SETI is about is an altruistic effort. Very much in lines with my own sociological views, which is you should be giving to the universe. You should be helping and aiding. And that really is, what do you possibly get in return in your mortal lifetime? Your great-great-grandchildren might benefit from a response to a message you send, but you don't benefit. It is fundamentally an altruistic undertaking, and that resonated with me enormously as well. So my interest in perception and my basic liberal upbringing, I think, went hand in hand with this. And it kills me that Senator Proxmire was a Democrat who killed, killed federal funding for SETI.
Yes.
My own little prejudicial Canadian perception of American politics was that guy has to be a mean-spirited little Republican, and he was a Democrat who killed this. It was the most altruistic thing that we were doing. We meaning you.
Yes, right, yes.
And it fell by the wayside.
Yeah, that I remember that going down, and I remember that being a rather sad occasion in the sense that it signaled a lack of optimism and as you say, altruism.
Yes.
I think that a nation as rich as ours, we shouldn't have nearly as many problems as we do in a lot of respects, but that a nation as rich as ours couldn't use a tiny fraction of that federal budget just to go see.
That's right, exactly. I mean, the other word that I think could have gone in that list of things that were dismissed on that day was imagination.
Yeah.
Was just thinking about wondrous thoughts about why are we here, what does it all mean, and that big one, are we alone? Those are good questions.
Yeah.
And science fiction, what science fiction is a laboratory for thought experiments, particularly thought experiments that could never practically be done, or at least not practically be done right now. So we ask ourselves, what would the impact be if we received an alien communication? What would it be if that communication contained content that upset our belief system? What would be the motivations for us to reply? Who would stand between us and replying? And I have to say, and maybe you did too, I cringed today at lunch. I love Andy Fracknoy, who's a great friend, and he's been a great supporter of mine. He often does columns about science fiction that has good science. But he asked Frank Drake, and he said, or is this just science fiction? And Frank said, no, it's not science fiction. And what Andy meant is, or is this just fantasy?
Yeah.
And what Frank meant is, no, it's not fantasy.
Right.
Science fiction is a major, important part of a rigorous intellectual dialogue about things that might plausibly be. And SETI is the closest discipline to a science fictional discipline that you can still actually get tenure for studying.
Right. Another one of my favorite Sawyer books is Flash Forward. And of course, you had an interesting experience with Hollywood and Flash Forward. I remember shortly after I first met you, I read that book and really enjoyed it. And fool that I am, didn't really think ahead to like, oh, I should option this from Rob and try to turn it into a TV show. Somebody, of course, did.
Yes.
And in fact, people that I know, I worked on a show called Threshold in the, when was it, 2005?
2005.
That was developed and directed, the pilot was directed by David Goyer.
Yes.
And Brandon Braga was the head writer, and they were also the powers behind
Adapting Flash Forward.
Adapting Flash Forward. Talk to us a little bit about that experience, having
Yeah.
your work adapted, your role as the creator of this world, the novelist, but you were not a TV writer producer per se, so.
Right. Yes, absolutely. First, I want to say up front, it was a wonderfully positive experience. The default mode for a writer is to get on a soapbox and say, Hollywood screwed me over. They ruined my work, or they did me out of my money, or whatever. And the bottom line is, my work is always there. What did people say, how could you let them do that to your book? They didn't do anything to my book. My book is right here. Go read it. And I made an awful lot of money, so I have no complaints. And Brandon and David treated me with great respect. And I'll tell you, it was on Threshold that Flash Forward transitioned from being a movie to being a TV series. Because David and Brandon had a meal together, and they were working on this, and they said, you know, Brandon said to David, what else are you working on? And David said, well, I've got this Rob Sawyer novel that I'm thinking of adapting. And Brandon said, which one? They were both fans of my work. And David said, Flash Forward. And Brandon said, that'd make a great TV series. And David said, no, it's a feature. No, Brandon said, no, it's a TV series, and here's how you do it. And from that point, David said, do you want to collaborate on the pilot? And they went out with it after that. Very much Brandon's sensibility. You can see it in what happened in the TV series. You know, Brandon also went on to write for 24 and was significantly responsible for the the second season of Enterprise with the season-long the Zindi threat, the post 9/11, and all of that, and all of those Brandon-esque touches are in the Flash Forward series. It was a very liberal adaptation, and many writers get their hackles up. I'm friends with Anne McCaffrey, just passed away, and Todd McCaffrey, her son, and Ron Moore, of course, wanted to adapt Dragonflight and Dragon Riders of Pern novels, but he didn't like the backstory bit that Thread could jump from the Red Star, which is a red planet, to Earth, to Pern. He didn't believe that, and so he devised an alternative backstory, and Anne said, no, you do not alter the canon of Pern, and she walked away from the project. When David and Brandon suggested alterations, we sat at Chateau Montmartre, which is a famous Hollywood, as you well know, place where Hollywood deals are done, and they said, here's what we have to change, 3 things, and the rationale made perfect sense at the time. If I ever write The Making of Flash Forward, the title of the book will be, It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the time. At the time. And Brandon and I, actually I've got a meeting with Brandon on Tuesday. It's a phone conference, and I'm going down. I was just in LA a little while ago for a quick meeting with Brandon. Brandon and I are working on trying to develop something else together and having a blast. I would work with any one of those guys again in a moment. Intelligent people.
David is, I've known Brandon for almost 20 years now. Obviously worked with him from the beginning on Star Trek, and David, more recently. But yeah, I like them both a lot. David, of course, is a powerhouse film director and screenwriter. He's, rewrote.
Batman Begins is the most famous of his,
And he's doing a series right now in England about Leonardo da Vinci.
Oh, is that what he's up to?
Fun.
That's cool.
He's been in England the last couple of months. So, but yeah, I know it's always tough to try to take something that exists in the form of a book or a short story and translate that into terms that work on TV.
Yes, and, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, and translate it into a story-generating engine that can give you 100 episodes. Because my novel is one complete story with a definitive ending, as it should be in a novel. You pay for a story, I give you a story. When you go to Hollywood, they say, when you go to pitch in Hollywood, they don't just ask you, so what's the pilot? They say, so what's episode 55? How far can you go with this? Because they need, 3, 4 seasons to syndicate and ultimately make their money back.
Yes.
And that's a very valid question to ask. How do you convert it? And I got to say, for me, as a lifelong science fiction fan, many of my favorite works of science fiction are liberal adaptations. And so I knew going into this, I had my eyes wide open. I love the 1968 Planet of the Apes. It's very different from Pierre Boelle's novel, 1963 novel, Le Planète des Singes, which is the French title. I love 2001: A Space Odyssey. If you read the original short story, it's an adaptation actually of 5 Clarke short stories, but most prominently The Sentinel, very different from The Sentinel. I love classic Star Trek, which is a liberal adaptation of Forbidden Planet, which is a liberal adaptation of The Tempest. So how can I say, you know, that Hollywood should treat my words as holy writ when the things that I loved were liberal adaptations?
Well, and it was, you know, in pretty much every respect, a very successful show. It was an expensive show.
It was an expensive show. It was the fastest selling program in Disney's history. Disney owns ABC, the network, and ABC Studios. First day on sale, we sold 100 markets worldwide. The fastest selling program in Walt Disney's entire history. And it was all over the world, in some countries a big hit, some countries less so. Unfortunately, we ran into 2 things. We were filmed in, you know, people kept saying to me, oh, where's it filmed? Assuming, because I'm a Canadian, that it's going to be in Toronto or Vancouver. We were in Los Angeles on the Disney lot. Our writer's room was adjacent to the Lost writer's room. Our soundstage was adjacent to the Cougar Town soundstage at the Disney lot. And we were expensive. The same season, there was V. V was done in Vancouver and was cheaper. And the then president of ABC had a very common prejudice, which is to say, all right, I have to have a science fiction program on my schedule, but I don't really need to have more than one. So it was made pretty clear during when we were picked up for the back 9, the rest of the season, that either we or V would get renewed, but not both. And in the end, our ratings and V's ratings were pretty damn comparable, but our costs were way, way higher. We starred, you know, movie stars, Joseph Fiennes and John Cho, and we were made in Los Angeles, and that killed us ultimately.
Well, we have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have a question for Rob? Please raise your hand.
It's almost possible to see them. Wave your hand like this, because it's almost possible to see.
Yes, is that Adrian over there?
Can you give us any teases about what might be the future for example, this project that you mentioned with Brandon?
Brandon and I are talking about adapting Wake, Watch, and Wonder, my World Wide Web trilogy. Brandon has been interested in it since before it was published. He saw it in manuscript. So back in 2009, we were talking about it on the set of Flash Forward. And Brandon was encumbered with 24 and then Terra Nova. And now he's finally got lacunae in his schedule where he can move on to new projects. And so that's what we're talking about. In terms of my next work, it's apropos that you have Mars here. My next novel, is, which will be out April 2nd of next year, is called Red Planet Blues, and it's a hard-boiled detective novel set on Mars. Mars about 100 years in the future. And actually, I wrote it very much with kind of a story-generating engine in mind. And I'm also working with some other producers on trying to get an adaptation of that up and running before the book comes out. What's happened to the detective genre is it's almost impossible to do detective stories these days. In the post-CSI era, real and fictional, almost anything, any crime you commit, you're going to be nailed for because you're leaving evidence behind. And in the post-Department of Homeland Security era, almost anything you do is tracked or retroactively recoverable. And so the idea that the kind of clever detective fiction that Columbo was involved with 30 years ago, you can't tell those stories today without people saying, well, why wasn't this, why wasn't that? So moving it to a frontier Mars in the wake of the great Martian fossil rush, with half the population having uploaded their consciousnesses into android bodies that have no biometrics and don't shed DNA, and so on and so forth, lets us tell detective stories that are based on the detective's ratiocination, figuring things out, instead of Marg Helgenberger showing up and saying, well, okay, here's the blood sample, and in 8 seconds we've sequenced the DNA, you did it, and that's the end of the show. And so it was very much, it's a great standalone novel, it concludes, blah, 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 but I was very much writing something that I hoped would have a springboard to Hollywood. And we got the 5-minute sign about a minute ago,
Okay.
but whatever.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Don't be shy.
I can't even see if there's anybody else.
Yes, you, sir.
I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the new e-publishing craze and self-publishing and stuff like that? Do you think the traditional publishing industry is on its way out?
It's in enormous trouble, and to be perfectly blunt and honest, one of the reasons I'm working so hard to parlay what success I had with Flash Forward into more film and television work is I'm convinced there'll be a film and TV industry 10 years from now. I'm not convinced there will be a traditional publishing industry 10 years from now. In terms of e-publishing and self-publishing, you know, it was just announced last week that for the first time, ebooks have exceeded hardcover sales on average in the United States. And that's going to continue to be the trend. Unfortunately, writers groups are useless. Writers for television have a single voice, the Writers Guild of America. We're both members. And they go and argue and fight for our rights with everybody. But science fiction writers have a separate professional organization from mystery writers, from romance writers, from thriller writers. Divide and conquer. The publisher said your share will be 25% of net proceeds on ebooks, and that's not enough. And the publishers, the authors did not get organized, and it's become the de facto standard. And I honestly, actually, you can go search on my blog for this blog post, are the days of the full-time novelist numbered? I think they are, and I'm making real efforts to transition my principal income stream away from publishing. In terms of e-publishing, and I'll take the final 30 seconds here because I know my great friend Bob at the back there is the next guy up here. In terms of e-publishing yourself, those who have been generally succeeding are people like myself who already have an established reader base. There are outliers, there absolutely are outliers, Amanda Hawking being the one everybody cites. And all I can say to people who want to e-publish is, if your business model is that I too shall be a miraculous outlier, I wish you luck. But more likely you're going to have the standard income from your ebook, and the vast majority of people who are self-publishing are making less than $1,000 a book in doing so. And that is the likely fate of self-publishing in ebooks. People say, yeah, but it's just the early days of ebooks. I think that that doesn't mean that that figure is going to grow, but rather the number of people getting this very small amount of money is going to spread wider and wider. So right now there are 10,000 people making $1,000 a book, and 5 years from now there'll be 5 million people making $1,000 a book. And I suspect that literally, yes, we're at a transitional stage in human culture where the standalone author of simple prose narrative, not embellished with multimedia, is going to transition out of being a central part of our culture. Sorry to say that, but it's true.
Well, on that somewhat
yes.
cloudy note, I want to thank you, Rob, so much for sitting
Oh,
down. And
what a pleasure,
great
Andre.
to sit and have a conversation
Yeah.
with you. We rarely seem to get to do that. So
I know, but
we'll
it
have
always
to-
is a pleasure when we do. We met at a conference like this about 5
Yes.
years ago, and it's always a pleasure to see you, Andre.
Great. Well, thank you so
Cheers.
much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.